A recipient of 2 consecutive Palmer-Dixon Prizes for Best Composition presented by the Juilliard School, composer Mathew Fuerst has also received 3rd prize in the 2nd annual Antonin Dvorak composition competition held in Prague, Czech Republic. Other prizes include numerous ASCAP awards and being selected as a finalist in the Whitaker Competition, presented by the American Composers Orchestra. He holds a bachelor's degree in composition from the Eastman School of Music, where he studied with David Liptak, Christopher Rouse, Joseph Schwantner, Sidney Hodkinson, and Augusta Read Thomas, and piano with Alan Feinberg. His Masters and Doctorate degrees in composition are from the Juilliard School, where he worked with Robert Beaser and John Corigliano. Now, please join William Ford from AtlantaMusicCritic.com in conversation with Mathew Fuerst.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
Hey, thanks for taking some time to talk.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Well, one of the things that is interesting to me, and I think to people who watch, is how people got to be where they are and who they are based upon some of their past history, which leads me into the first question. Can you think back to the very first time that music intrigued you?
Probably the moment that most sticks out in my mind was after we moved to our home outside Chicago when I was 6 years old, from outside LA. My mom had bought a piano. She had taken some piano lessons as a child, and I kind of considered starting them up again. And apparently, I guess I was really fascinated by the instrument. I was fascinated by the buttons that make sound, at least to my mind. And according to my mom, I don't remember any of this, but I guess I begged her for about 6 months, practically every day, wanting to take piano lessons. And she, I think she was trying to avoid the inevitable fights that go into practicing and things like that. It's like, oh, you're gonna have to practice every day. And I guess every day I was just like, that's fine. I want to do this. I want to do this. And after 6 months, I think she's just kind of like, well, I mean, he really seems to want to do this. Let's just go with this and see what happens. And so fortunately, my parents are very, very supportive, of my career. And so I got started with piano lessons, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Your mother was musically inclined. Was your father?
No, he was not. And my mom took piano lessons for a while as a child, and that was about it. But we had music, I guess, in the house growing up. I remember I must have been 3 or 4 years old, really loving, Mary Poppins and the Hallelujah Chorus. Like I actually distinctly remember loving, we had one of those records of like, so-and-so's greatest hits, but it was like the greatest hits of the greatest hits type of a thing. And I remember loving listening to the Hallelujah Chorus as a kid.
You actually began to express this interest by playing the piano. They were okay with that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they were very supportive.
Was there ever an issue of getting you to practice?
Oh, sure. As I got a little bit older and as the practice sessions, increased, I think I would say probably by the time I was 12 years old, I was practicing probably 2.5 to 3 hours a day. There were days I just didn't want to practice. On the flip side, however, whenever I was done practicing, I loved staying on the piano and improvising and trying to improvise on the music I was playing, or try to, come up with something that sounded like Beethoven or, whichever composer I was listening to at the time.
Was there ever a time during the breadth of your musical career, you said, oh no, I want to stop?
Yes, I did quit piano for one day when I was younger. It might have been even a week, but I went back to it. And the only other time that there was, I think, a moment of real questioning whether or not I wanted to continue was actually in my 30s. I had hit kind of a nadir in my career. Commissions dried up, performances dried up. I had left New York City, was kind of in the middle of nowhere, Michigan, teaching, and my wife at the time, my fiance, I remember coming home from teaching, just saying to her, I just don't know what's the point. no one seems to care. Maybe it's time for me just to stop. About a week and a half later, I got a commission to write a new violin sonata from Canadian violinist Jasper Wood and pianist David Riley, whom I've worked with a fair amount actually in my career. This piece ended up being, as I think I just said, the third violin sonata, which ended up being kind of, I feel like a bit of a breakthrough piece for me. The one thing that really helped me through this kind of compositional crisis was some advice that Chris Rouse gave to me once when I was at Juilliard, saying to me that very often at some point, in one's 30s, early 30s, composers go through this period, this kind of crisis where you just don't know what the next stage is. You don't, there's a lot of uncertainty in what one does. And I remember him saying to me, the key to keep remembering is you just have to work through it. And remember, we've all been through it, just keep working through it. And what'll emerge is the next stage of your development. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here because it was a conversation that went kind of, I wasn't expecting him to start sharing some of this, but this ended up being pivotal, I think, in helping me continue to compose.
When you were an adolescent, what did your friends think of your practicing and your interest in music? Or did they think about it?
I'm not sure they thought that much about it. To be honest, I'm not sure I had that many friends. I don't remember too much about that. I was really lucky that I was able to go to the first Interlochen Arts Camp, and then I went to the Academy for 3 years in high school. My memory more of my youth really stems from my time at Interlochen more than anywhere else. And of course, a school like that, we're all sitting there practicing. It's just part of our lives. And so it felt very much at home there.
Did you play in the orchestra in high school?
I played at Interlochen. I would play the piano if they needed something like so if they were playing, for example, the Pines of Rome, I would play the piano part in that, which was great because it was one of the few times I got to experience being in an orchestra within that and hearing the instruments. And yeah, outside of that though, anytime I worked with an orchestra, I was actually the soloist, which is of course a very different experience than being in the orchestra.
That's as piano soloist.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And when was that?
The first time I was 12 years old, playing Beethoven's Second Piano Concerto. And the second time was at Interlochen playing Ravel's G major. And then at Eastman, I played a movement of one of my own piano concertos. And then I played the first three movements of Ligeti's Piano Concerto my senior year. I guess 4 times I've had the opportunity to be a soloist.
Can you recount your educational history?
I would say it really starts with going to Interlochen at 15 as a sophomore. I got in as a double major, piano and composition. After that, I went to the Eastman School of Music, where again, I entered as a double major. However, I did drop the piano major officially, though I still stayed in Alan Feinberg's studio and continued doing a lot of accompanying and giving solo recitals and things like this. And I went from being a double major, just composition. And I studied with David Liptak, Christopher Rouse, Joseph Schwantner, Sid Hodkinson, and Augusta Read Thomas. They have a rotation there, which is really great. You get to work with all of these wonderful composers that teach there. After that, I got to spend a summer in Paris at La Scuola Cantorum, studying with Sam Adler. And then I got my Masters and Doctorate at Juilliard, where I spent 4 years studying with Robert Beaser and 1 year studying with John Corigliano.
What was your experience in Paris like?
Oh, loved it. It was a month, the month of July, but it was one of the most wonderful months of my life. It was the first time being overseas. I'd always been kind of fascinated with Paris, especially like reading about the 1920s when I was younger, reading about, whether it's the Dadaists and the Surrealists or just all the great music that was coming out of Paris at that time. And so being in Paris was great. There were, I think, about 20 of us that were studying there. Some really remarkable composers, including Paola Persini and Nico Muley. And Nico, I met there at that summer festival. We've been friends since. So it was a really great experience.
After you left Juilliard, you went to where?
Well, I stayed in New York for a couple years. doing some freelance teaching and doing some composing. I turned 30, realized that the city for me was becoming a city for the young and the rich. And I was finding I was becoming neither fast, and started applying for jobs. So I taught at a small liberal arts school in Michigan for about 8 years. And it's in Michigan where I met my wife. And then we moved out to Lincoln, Nebraska in 2016. And then as the pandemic began, and I started, my kind of online teaching with my composition studio, we realized we needed a bigger house. And so we moved out here to Omaha, where we live now with our 4-year-old twin daughters.
When you were in Lincoln, what did you do there?
I taught at Doane University. I was teacher. I taught there for about 4 years. Great place to work, wonderful faculty, really wonderful students. I had a great time teaching the students.
What is the process you go through in composing? Like, do you take a notebook when you're out eating at McDonald's and you have an idea and you write it down? Or do you sit down at home and say, geez, I'm going to address world hunger, and so I'm going to compose this? Or do you just start, face a blank page and say, here you go?
I'm smiling because one of the things that I like to do with trial lessons with all my students is I always end by asking this very question: what is your process? And I'm smiling because I always tell them, I always know what the answer is. The only real answer is it depends. And so, I'm finding myself now in their shoes. Well, it depends, So I often will work in the morning because I find that that's the easiest time to work. Before our daughters wake up, I'll get up at 5 a.m. and try to get at least a few hours in. Depending on the piece, I may start with kind of some formal ideas. Very often I'll have at least some sort of musical idea that I might sketch out. In fact, I have those Moleskine books. I have one that's for musical sketches, and then one that's for kind of formal sketches that I like to use. If it's a song, obviously I'll be working on the text, looking at the text, and kind of thinking about how to structure the piece around the text. If it's a piece like the piece that was just premiered in Lincoln, the piano trio, I'll sometimes think about the musicians I'm writing for. I'll think about sometimes just the type of piece that I want to write, and just kind of go from there. I mean, it really does depend.
You said it, the type of music or the type of piece. Does that mean like for a quartet or a trio? Usually
instrumentation is basically decided for me, depending on the commission. So for example, referring back to the piece written for Hey Young, Greg and Soyen that was premiered in Lincoln, I knew it was going to be a piano trio. So the instrumentation was done with that. They gave me flexibility in terms of length of time, that the piece is going to be, and structure and everything else. So I got to determine all of that. That particular piece is perhaps interesting because of all the stages it took to write it. It's a 2-movement work. The first movement was done in the summer of 2019. And we even workshopped it at an arts residency at Avaloq. And then after we worked on it a bit together, I went home, did some editing, and then wrote 3 other movements. And these 3 other movements were a little darker in nature. One of the movements was directly influenced by, kind of the political situation. And on top of that, the synagogue, the local synagogue was vandalized, and that was kind of as you can imagine, really kind of shakes you a bit when something like that happens. But on top of that, I was again going through one of those periods of having a real, just kind of struggling to figure out what next in my own composition, and what do I want to do next. And so the piece was completed and was supposed to be premiered April 1st of 2020. But of course, with the pandemic, that premiere got canceled. And so when we heard about the Lincoln Friends of Chamber Music performance, I went back and looked at the music this past summer and realized that, these 3 other movements are awfully dark. And after all this time that we've spent, it says, I don't know if I want to revisit this, and you start to sit there and you realize real quickly, well, if I don't want to hear this, why am I subjecting audiences to this? And even more so, why am I imposing my friends, I have to learn this, and so I ended up throwing out the second, third, and fourth movements. I wrote another movement and this movement, because of kind of the technical nature of it, I actually initially wrote it all out by hand, which is not something I always do, but for this piece I did. And as I was inputting it into the computer, I started thinking about a future commission I have to write Hey Young a sonata for violin and piano. And so I started kind of playing around with what I wanted to do, how to make it, kind of a personal sonata for her. And one of the things that struck me was trying to incorporate her family's name into the music. So I started playing around with her daughter's names and found myself very quickly having that music just kind of in my head a lot and thinking about it all the time. And soon I realized this is really where my inner ear or my head really wants to be. Scrap this other movement. Let's go this route and work on this piece. And in the end, I think the piece is significantly more, perhaps for a lack of a better word, joyful. Certainly, I think it has a more positive outlook, say, than the very original trio, which really did end kind of negatively. It ended, I would say, even a bit violently. So it ended up becoming a completely different piece. But this is kind of an extreme example of some of the process that I go through, but nevertheless one that maybe sheds at least some light in what I do.
Your music then can have a programmatic agenda.
Sometimes. So for example, my third violin sonata, the piece I talked about earlier, the second movement of that was actually a wedding gift for my wife. And it was actually the processional music for our wedding. And I took a chord progression from a string quartet I wrote for the New York City Ballet's Choreographic Institute that she really liked and turned it into a chaconne, which is just a repeated, a set of variations based on repeated chord progression. And then the outer two movements, I was kind of in some ways experimenting with new techniques that I'd never worked on before, particularly in the first movement. But in the last movement, I knew I wanted to have something really joyful. I wanted to just, I was getting married to the woman I love. I want to express this joy. Likewise, I have a trio for vibraphone, cello, and piano. The entire piece, which is about 23 minutes long, is really, I think, expressing my joy of the birth of our daughters. The last movement even is a lullaby to my daughters. So it has, I think some of my music can have inspired by personal things, though may not necessarily have a direct storyline per se. Just thinking about this now, I have a 2-piano piece called Nocturne that was inspired by our honeymoon. We kind of toured around Eastern Europe and spent some time in Budapest. And this walk I remember in particular at night along the Danube and seeing, the Parliament building reflected on the water and hearing the bells. And so all that's kind of in the piece, though it's not outside of, say, having 11 chimes at the beginning and 12 chimes at the end, the kind of book in the piece. I'm not sure there's anything beyond that would be necessarily programmatic, but some of the musical decisions were inspired by non-musical things.
Do you expect your audience to understand it on first hearing what you are attempting to do? In other words, your experience is one thing, an audience member's experience is God knows what. How does that all shake out for you? Do you just write it for you and then hope they come along with it?
That's a really good question. To me, an audience member is going to bring their own experiences, right? When listening to a piece of music, whether or not they sit there and can say, I hear, Greg and Hey Young's daughter's names, or, I can hear that as a lullaby, or versus say, I hear this more as XYZ. I don't think it really matters as long as they're moved by the piece. I have found that if I write a piece of music that's really well constructed, that the technique is truly in service of what I'm trying to express, then my hope is that some sort of communication will get across to the audience, whether or not they listen to it and hear, water, or they hear just arpeggio. So one of the things I tell my students sometimes going back to my parents, they may listen to, say, the Moonlight Sonata or Clair de Lune and hear, the moon, rippling on the water or whatever. But in both cases, what I'm listening to is the technical things, and it's not that one is any better or worse than the other. It's just, as you said, our experiences. It actually reminds me, one of the best compliments I ever received about my music was in 2000, during the summer of 2000, when a few of us from Juilliard went on tour in Scotland. We went kind of all around Scotland, and it was amazing. It would love to go back to that country. And so my job, after writing a piece of music for them, was to give just a little bit of a pre-concert talk, make sure that there was a place that we could eat after the concert. And after one particular concert, this gentleman came up to me, and he's told me how much he loved the piece, and he just had this whole image in his head of my experience being a New Yorker, waking up in the morning and going outside, and the action of New York and the energy, and then just the awesomeness of being in New York at night with all the lights, and then going to bed and gently going to sleep. And he told me this whole narrative. It was incredible. But the piece was about none of that. The piece was really about just this technical thing, me trying to figure out for the first time in my life how I can develop an idea. And it was a purely technical exercise for me. Obviously, I wanted to have, exciting climactic moments and things like this, but it was a remarkable moment for me to sit there and listen to this gentleman tell me this very detailed narrative that he got out of the piece of music, and I thought, this is, then I've succeeded. He got something out of it, and that's perfect. Mm-hmm.
That the listener takes their own collection of experiences and applies it to the music.
Yeah, I think that's very, very true. And that's part of the reason why I think so many of my titles are so just absolutely generic. Sonata number 1, sonata number 2, string quartet number 1, string quartet number 2. It's even back as a student, I actually remember a lesson where Beaser and I talked about my titles, and he was just like, maybe think about trying to have more more descriptive titles, something beyond just string quartet, and he's not, and he's got a really good point about that, I think, because it can help the audience along the way. For me though, I just don't think I have my imagination works that well that way. So I'm just more comfortable calling things a sonata or trio or what have you. The whole thing with titles, I think very often is just kind of to either set up the audience with a certain sort of expectation, or give some clue as to something about the piece. One of my favorite is a piece of Ligeti's Clocks and Clouds, a beautiful piece of music for female choir and orchestra. And I think it really does describe kind of the way the music sounds, particularly, given he was inspired by the fog in San Francisco and things like this. And you can kind of hear just the very slow moving harmonies, and just it's a gorgeous piece of music. And I think it's a really wonderful title.
Ligeti is a favorite.
Yeah, I would say Brahms and Ligeti are probably my two favorite composers.
Is there a connection?
Well, I think there's obviously a connection when you look at, say, Ligeti's work, and one of his major works, especially is the 1981 Horn Trio, directly inspired by Brahms, and both pieces were written after the death of each composer's respective mothers. Likewise, Brahms's interest in what was considered, Hungarian folk music with his, Hungarian dances and everything else. Compositionally, for me, they're somewhat different. I think with Brahms, what I love about Brahms is just the mastery of technique, the small details, and for me, he's kind of an artistic ideal. I want to have my technique that, to that level, that I could do what I want with the music and have it be expressive to some sort. In fact, I'll show you above my desk. Actually, I have pictures of composers all over, but the biggest one is Brahms, to kind of remind me of what my end goals are as a composer. But also, anytime I start to feel really good about myself, I'll look at that and just say, nope, got a ways to go. With Ligeti, what I love about him is the extremes of his music, whether you're talking about dynamics or whether you're talking about intonation, orchestration, range. I find that really fascinating. And playing his piano concerto at Eastman was I would say a pivotal moment in my experience as a musician, just getting to spend so much time with the music, getting those kind of rhythms, in my ears and in my hands, and really thinking about the concept of virtuosity and what is the end goal of virtuosity. And Ligeti has played a huge influence on my life. In fact, our dog is named after Ligeti even. So it's, so these two composers I think are the ones that have meant the most to me.
What I read about your music is that you have very complex rhythms and no key signatures mostly, but a lot of accidentals.
I think my music, particularly after the violin sonata, is mainly triadic, but I try to avoid having the kind of the standard chord progressions 1-4-5-1. Part of this was inspired and influenced by composers like Rachmaninoff and Prokofiev, who were composers I loved as a kid. To the point where I used to, be fascinated by their harmonies. I used to like to just sit and just play triads as a kid, trying to, listen to what different triads sounded like next to each other. And then also thinking about something that John Corigliano said to me in a lesson once, which is I showed him actually this that piano concerto I was talking about earlier that I was writing. The second movement had a fugue, and he said to me, this is a good fugue, it's a good piece of music, well orchestrated. But what stuck with me is what he said next. He said, "But Matt, you're a 21st century composer. What does it mean to write a fugue in the 21st century versus the 20th versus the 19th versus the 18th? What does that mean? What does it mean to be, a New York resident in America in the 21st century writing, quartet, sonata, name the genre?" And so for me, as I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next, one of the things I realized back in writing the third violin sonata is I wanted to use triads. I like triads. I wanted to kind of go back and do what I used to do as a kid, kind of in a way, playing with the sound of triads, but I also wanted to make sure they were organized, whichever, cycle of harmonies I wanted to use. And so the solution I came up with, and this is particularly, you can see this in the first movement of the sonata, was taking a 12-tone row and just using the 12-tone row as the notes of the 12-tone row as the roots for the chords, and then going through the cycle that way, just and then modulating so that I start in one key, and then I would modulate, say, to the key B of the second chord, and just transpose everything, and then the third, fourth, and so forth, so that the chaconne progression would be expressed the moment to moment, but also across, you could see it across the entire piece in terms of where I modulated. And this was actually inspired by Mandelbrot sets and self-similarity and these kind of things that I was really interested in, especially at that time, reading books about this. And so this is my attempt to try to figure out how to create and write chaconnes in a way that I felt hopefully is a little more contemporary than, say, a treatment of a chaconne back in 1911 or 1811 or 1711 and so forth. When I teach my composition students, one thing I tell them, think about this always, what does this mean to you? What is your experience as a musician, as a listener, as someone, living wherever they happen to be living? And in the end, what music do you want to hear? I tell my students all the time, I think if you write the music you want to hear and write it to the best of your technical ability, there's going to be an audience for it. It may not be a huge audience, but people will respond, and I have found that to be very much the case. With the third sonata, for example, I started writing it being heavily influenced by some of the music that was coming out of Brooklyn around 2007, 2008, 2009, kind of that indie, what some people call indie classical. I'm not sure I like that term. I don't know if any of the composers that fall into that umbrella like that term either. But nevertheless, I find myself trying to write kind of in the style of, and it was decent music, but just sounded a bit artificial to me. And so the moment for me that I still remember, if no one seems to be caring about me, why am I caring about them? I'm just going to write what I want to hear, because it'll get one performance and, the sun will come up tomorrow. Nothing's going to change. And then a strange thing happened. I started enjoying writing again. And likewise, people seem to suddenly start taking notice of my music and interest in my music. And it was a huge lesson of just reminding myself, okay, if I'm honest with writing what I want to hear to the best of my ability, technically, people will be interested because I will actually be presenting my voice, or what one might be able to call my voice. I feel like that's what audiences, my opinion is that's what people are most interested in. But it is interesting listening to how composers can kind of blend these influences, and how that comes a unique voice. The other thing I always tell students about, kind of along these lines, is being a father of twins, being fascinated by seeing the personalities of my two daughters. How different they are as people, of course, right? But as I watch them and they do certain gestures or say things a certain way, I can sit there and say, yeah, they picked up that from Rachel, or they picked that up from me, or they picked that up from a friend at school. But they pick up all these little elements. But in the end, it's fascinating to me to see what they pick up, and out of that emerges like a unique and individual. And I think composition is very much the same way, which is what makes it so fascinating. You can sit and look at look at Beethoven. He claims to have learned nothing from Haydn, yet his music suggests otherwise all over the place. One of my favorites is the use of the sforzando, or the sudden accent. In Haydn, it's always kind of a wink and a nudge. In Beethoven, he feels like he's pounding you over the head with it, but it clearly took some of this from Haydn. So it's a very fascinating, I think, topic.
So you're doing online instruction, mentoring, coaching?
During the pandemic, as I started getting comfortable, teaching on Zoom, I thought, let's just see if I'm able to, get some composition students, from around the country. So I launched some advertisements back in November, about a year ago, and by late February, early March, my wife and I sat down and looked at the numbers, of students I had. That feasibly, is it possible to kind of shift careers? And when we realized it was, I decided to teach online full time, which is what I do now. So the way it typically works is, once a student signs up to be a part of my studio, after a free trial lesson, I'll usually send a Zoom link a couple days prior and ask for the music the night before. So, because I like to spend about a half hour with everyone's music beforehand, listening to it with and without the score. If I'm not certain about the way I feel about something, I'll kind of walk away from it and come back to it later on and re-listen again with fresh ears to determine whether or not my initial reaction was something I still agree with. Sometimes it takes a few hearings to really kind of understand the structure, or understand what a student may be doing, and then I can give better feedback based off of multiple listenings than just kind of like a one and done, and, well, this is what I think. And so to me, that's very, very important. I'll always mark up their scores on my tablet with my Apple Pencil, and I have two screens, so I'll put it up on the screen. We'll look at the music together. I'll have a bunch of suggestions. I'll sometimes jot things, maybe sketch out something that they could, consider this. And our discussion can be about a number of things depending on what stage they're at. And I have students from all over the country and even all over the world now. I can technically say I have one student in London and one in China. And also I tell them that anytime they have questions about anything, to always reach out and ask. I never charge for emails. There have been times where someone will ask a question, or they're stuck on something. I'll just say, okay, let's just meet for 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Let's talk about this. Let me help you. I'm much more concerned about making sure that they can, get over whatever hurdle or that's kind of blocking their way, than to have them sit and wait a week or two, or whenever their next lesson is, and feel like they can't reach out and ask. I'm unconcerned about sitting there nickel and diming them. I want to make sure I'm fair to them and fair to myself, of course, right? But nevertheless, to me, that's very, very important. That's something that my students, I'm happy to say, seem really comfortable doing. I want to make sure that they're comfortable to do that. And so, sometimes it may be that. Other times we may just be talking about structure. So one of the things, it's this kind of an offshoot of something I learned from Corigliano, but it's thinking about form. With Corigliano, he always talked about a singular climax, even in a multi-movement work, having one climax and shaping all the other climaxes around that. So, and with Corigliano, you'd often like sketch things out. You have this like map. It's really cool. But with my own musical interests, I often have kind of done something a little bit different, but it's still the basic same process, which I'll ask students, how does the piece begin? And, starts softly, starts, dramatically, just some sort of adjective or something that kind of gets the ball rolling for them. How does the piece end? And same sort of things. It ends triumphantly. It ends quietly. It ends like a lullaby, whatever. And I find very often any composer can answer those two questions, but the ones that the one that they can't answer, and I can always hear when they can't answer, is what happens at the climax. And I talk about the importance of making sure that climactic moment really does stand out, that to maximize that effect for the audience. Is this the moment where it's just the loudest moment, the softest moment? Is it the moment that everything kind of comes together momentarily? What is it? What makes this stand out? And I find that for me, at least, very often when students start thinking about this, their music does have a little more directness in terms of the expressive quality and the sense of narrative that I think it's kind of all music is really about. It's heard more clearly and more directly. And when I say all this, I don't mean like, necessarily, reverting back to writing like Tchaikovsky, instead to make it understood. It's more the concept of shape. Going back to Ligeti, this is why I think Ligeti, one of the reasons Ligeti is of all those Darmstadt composers, by far the most popular. In all his works, you can hear that structure. You can hear those shapes. Atmospheres, for example, if you know the piece, it's very clear where the climax is. You have the piccolos at fortissimo, and then the bass is at fortissimo. You have this extreme jump suddenly. But as we look at the scores with my students, I always say to them, but notice also this is the only time he has this dramatic jump. So not only is this the highest point, the lowest point, and the loudest point, it's also the only time that some texture doesn't emerge from another texture. It's just a sudden cut. And all of these things allow us as the audience to be able to hear the shape of the piece. And that's why I think that music has such a magnificent impact on the listener.
I assume you're still composing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Part of the appeal of this was to give me more time to compose. So aside from teaching, what I love most to teach, which is composition, it also helps with having time to compose. Yeah.
A great conversation.
Oh, I'm glad. Thank you for the opportunity, really. So
I have appreciated it also. And
so thank you again for the opportunity. It's so great to talk to you. So great to meet you.
You bet. And glad that you could take the time.
Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Join at patreon.com/AtlantaMusicCritic. Produced by William Ford. Recorded via Zoom.